Meeting, and I'd like to call on Anne Galloway to open with the karakia for us.
E te hui, whai te mātauranga, kia mārama, kia whaitake nā mahi katoa, tu maia, tu kaha, aroha atu, aroha mai, tātou ia tātou katoa. So for this gathering, we seek knowledge, understanding and purpose in all we do. We stand tall, we are strong, and we show respect for each other.
Kia ora. Thank you. So we have apologies for Jake for absence, Councillor McClellan, and for Catherine Chu for lateness. Everyone else? So can I have a mover for those? Mel, seconded. Sam. All those in favour say aye. Aye. Opposed, that's carried. We're just receiving reports today, but if you did have a declaration of interest, please be vigilant and declare that. Confirmation of previous minutes from 7th of July. A mover for those? Jimmy, thank you. Seconded by Anne. Thank you very much. All those in favour say aye. Aye. Opposed, that's carried.
Oh,
Just Andrew. Did we hear from Andrew? Okay.
Yeah, he's just at a meeting after.
Right, okay. Thank you. You're going to put him in for lateness. So there's no deputations today, no petitions, and so therefore we move to the one item on the agenda, which is item 7, and that this is the Three Waters bi-monthly report, but it also includes quite a full 101, if you like, on the current Three Waters reforms proposed by the government. So this is the government's proposal on how New Zealand may move to a different model of delivering drinking water, dealing with wastewater and stormwater, with the idea that it's removed from local councils and given to an independent entity of yet to be confirmed sizes, but looking at 4 across New Zealand, and handing over our assets and our debt and our income at the same time. So I'll welcome Helen, and I think, is Therese going to come up to the table as well, or only if required, and Miles, to start us off on the reform, and then we'll move to the monthly report after that. So over to you, Helen, you've got a presentation.
Good morning, yes.
Thank you.
So we'll go through a brief presentation on water reform and the government's program and their preferred approach. So there have been a number of voices voicing concern about our urban water systems and the management of our water resources across the country for decades, in fact. So the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment back in 2001 released Ageing Pipes and Murky Waters, voicing his concern about both the legislative framework, the institutional arrangements and the performance of those who are responsible for urban water networks. The Auditor-General has also released several reports over the years as part of a water program, and that is looking at both service delivery and the management of the resource. So that has been a thorough program looking at water, and more recently, of course, the Infrastructure Commission has released a number of reports. In terms of the central government response, there are 2 parallel programs of reform underway. So there is the Essential Freshwater Program, that is mostly looking at our water resources and largely looking at the resource management system. And of course there's resource management reform happening in parallel with that. And then there is this water reform program looking at the service delivery as well as some of those regulatory and institutional requirements. So there's quite a lot of going on, and what we want to do is give an overview and see how it fits and what some of the implications are for us here in Christchurch. So we'll start looking at the case for change as it's been set out by central government in a number of reports. Then look at the 3 pole or pillars of water reform. Have a brief look at these 4 service entities that have been proposed in terms of their governance, the economic regulation that is proposed to be put in place, and consumer protections. Give you an overview of the various funding packages that have been announced over the last couple of years. Then look at what it means for Christchurch and talk about the engagement that's going on between the Crown and local authorities over the last couple of weeks and until the 1st of October, and then a next steps timeline. And I hope at the end to have plenty of time for questions and discussion. And we've got the team here, so we've got Teresa and Michael sitting in the background, and they will come forward for questions and discussions.
Right.
In terms of the case for change, the water services, the three water services, are critical to our communities. So they underpin health and wellbeing, and at their best, they provide safe drinking water, effective collection and disposal of wastewater, and good management of stormwater and land drainage. So our health and wellbeing clearly depends on these, and they are big business. So there are assets worth around 55 billion across the country, and almost 5,000 staff across the councils. So it's not an insignificant area of work that is proposed for reform. And of course our environment depends on well-managed resources, careful extraction of water for drinking, and then careful disposal of wastewater and stormwater. If we look at where that case for change is directed, it's largely at the local authorities. So there are 67 local authorities that currently own and operate those drinking water, wastewater and stormwater networks, and there are some significant challenges across those. In terms of complying with water safety standards, not only are we facing increased enforcement and monitoring requirements, but we are also looking at the prospect of increased regulatory standards, and the Water Services Bill, of course, is working its way through Parliament at the moment. There is also a big challenge with funding renewals. So there has been extensive urban development in the last century, and a lot of the infrastructure systems that underpin that urban development are now coming forward for renewal, and many small councils are struggling to fund those. Here in Christchurch, we know well the need to be resilient to natural hazards, both seismic challenges, but also flooding and intense rainfall events. So we need to look at how we build resilience into our networks for those and cope with any exacerbation of those challenges from climate change into the future. And the last one there is around supporting growth. And the government has a framework in place to support urban growth and providing infrastructure as a part of that. Focusing on each of the three waters and starting with drinking water, the Havelock North incident, the contamination incident back in 2016, really was an event that turned this from a relatively slow-moving policy program into a rapid program of action. So that was a turning point for the water reform program. That outbreak was in a town of just 14,000 people, and 5,500 people fell ill. So it was a significant event, and the costs of that are estimated at some 21 million, just from that one incident. And the Ministry of Health has put out some figures that say that 1 in 5 New Zealanders are supplied with drinking water that is not guaranteed to be safe from bacterial contamination. And indeed that is supported by the number of boil water notices that are in place across the country, some permanent and some temporary in response to incidents. So we do have some significant challenges in the drinking water space. Moving on to wastewater, there is no doubt that the discharge from wastewater treatment plants across the country is causing environmental impacts to surface waters and to coastal waters. And about a quarter of those plants are operating on expired consents. About another third will require resource consent within the next 10 years, and it's highly likely that those new consents will have stricter requirements in terms of the quality of that discharge and managing the environmental impacts of those discharges. The pictures there, of course, are of our Bromley plant, and you'll be pleased to know that that is operating within its consent, and that consent goes out to 2041. So the challenge is not so big here for Christchurch, although we do have a number of plants across on Banks Peninsula that we're looking to upgrade and consent. Moving to stormwater, and of course stormwater and land drainage is a big challenge for us here in Christchurch. So stormwater is what happens when rain falls on urban development, so be that residential or commercial, picks up contaminants, moves through our stormwater network, and then discharges that contaminant load into urban streams. So a number of stormwater service providers are operating without proper catchment management plans and without comprehensive stormwater discharge consents such as we have here. So there's a move to improve the management and regulation of stormwater discharges across the country. Here in Christchurch, of course, we take a 6 values approach. So we're not just interested in the quantity of water and making sure that we have effective drainage, but we're also interested in the range of outcomes across ecology, recreation, culture, landscape and amenity concerns. And our updated comprehensive stormwater consent has far greater requirements to improve the quality of that discharge than we've faced in the past. So moving from the three waters themselves, part of the government's case for change also addresses that infrastructure deficit, so the renewals that need to be put in place over the next 30 years. And the Officer of the Auditor General has reported that local authorities have consistently underinvested in their three waters assets, and that many of those local authorities also have incomplete and uncertain information about the condition of those assets. So not only have they underinvested, but they're not even sure what investment is required in the future. What central government has done for this reform program is take that incomplete information, use benchmarks and data from other local authorities and from overseas to confirm what the historical spend has been and then what the required spend would need to be in the future. So there is still some uncertainty in there and some assumptions that we will continue to test. To just put that infrastructure deficit into some sort of perspective, it's easy for us to talk in billions of dollars, but it's hard to really grasp how much needs to be spent and how much needs to be built. But what central government has done is look back at what the council spend has been historically, and across the country that has been around 40 billion. And then it's looked at what the council spend in its current LTPs is, and that's looking to be around 80 billion. And these are expenditures over a 30-year period, right? And then it's looking at what the investment is required in the future and has looked at a conservative investment requirement up to a high level investment requirement, a sort of worst case of what we need. So, and that investment is shown there in terms of the 120 and 185 billion. So looking at what we have been doing to what we are proposing to do now, that investment has doubled and central government is saying it needs to double again. So that's a big increase in terms of that investment in the pipes, the pump stations, the treatment plants, those networks right across the country. One of the challenges with that infrastructure deficit is that the needs and the costs don't fall evenly across communities. So the needs in the metropolitan councils are a little less, and the costs are more easily borne because of the economies of scale in those councils by the communities that they serve. So while there's an increase for the metropolitan councils, that increase is at the low end 150% of what we spend now, so only half as much again, up to the high end of 700%. But for provincial councils and rural councils, there's an orders of magnitude increase in costs. And many of those smaller communities simply cannot afford those costs, and without what central government is saying is that without reform and getting benefits of economies of scale, those communities simply could not afford to access safe drinking water or good sanitation services. So they would be left without those services. So we talked about the three waters, we've talked about the infrastructure deficit, and now just a look at those future challenges, and those are around climate change and growth. So we all have seen that climate change is bringing greater variation and extremes in our weather and our climate over time. So the rural and urban areas across the country are experiencing both more floods and more drought events. That is putting pressure on our infrastructure. We've seen them recently here in Canterbury with that weather bomb in May, and of course the Westport flooding they're still cleaning up. So the National Climate Risk Assessment has looked at the risk to the built environment and particularly to our water supply networks. So those changes in rainfall, temperature, drought, extreme weather events are all challenging our networks. Over in Banks Peninsula, we know that we're facing more water shortages and drought. Here in Christchurch, we're seeing more intense storm events. And of course, as a low-lying coastal city, we have a lot of networks at risk from sea level rise and more flooding across the eastern side of the city in particular. So moving from the case for change across to what reforms central government are proposing. And they're proposing reform across the institutions, in particular by establishing Taumata Arawai as a regulator. They're changing the regulations themselves, and the Water Services Bill is the primary vehicle for that, and of course the proposed reform of service delivery. They have engaged extensively across local government, iwi Māori and local communities. However, that's generally been at a relatively high level rather than in terms of the implications for individual communities and addressing individual requirements and concerns. So just moving through some of those changes, Taumata Arawai is an independent Crown entity, so it will take over as the drinking water regulator from the Ministry of Health and ensure that all communities have access to safe drinking water. They also have an oversight role in terms of wastewater and stormwater, and while that is still not clear, it looks as though it would lead to national standards in terms of the quality of those discharges and some consistency across the country. In terms of drinking water, which is their primary role and their primary focus at the moment, we will still need water safety plans. So water safety plans will be fundamental to understanding and managing risk. There is also the indication that drinking water standards will still be based on the World Health Organization standards as they are today. So those two things will be consistent. They've also begun to prepare guidance on what they're calling their operational compliance rules. So those are minimal requirements for how we operate our systems, how we monitor our systems, and how we report on the performance of those systems. And we have seen some initial drafts of that material. They have said that their approach will be one of education, alongside compliance, alongside enforcement where necessary. So they are operating as you would expect in terms of drinking water regulation. So moving from the institution to the Water Services Bill itself, so the Water Services Bill would repeal a part of the Health Act and replace it with a new standalone act. So that'll make it much more responsive really to any changes in terms of drinking water standards and requirements for community drinking water supplies. There has been public consultation on that act. The Select Committee is either has just or is about to report back, and this council of course made a submission focusing on the new requirement for mandatory residual disinfection, which essentially means chlorine in the water supply, and the exemption framework for that, as well as the expectation on councils to take on responsibility for private drinking water supplies. So we've looked at the institutions, we've looked at the Water Services Bill, which is the core piece of legislation, and so the next part is the water services delivery, and the central government's preferred model for addressing the issues is aggregation of delivery, and they have proposed 4 publicly owned water services entities to be established across New Zealand and take on the responsibilities that are currently delivered by those 67 local authorities for drinking water, wastewater and stormwater. Here in Christchurch we would be included in what is designated up there as Entity D, which is most of the South Island, and of course the boundaries of that follow the Ngāi Tahu Takiwā. That has a total population just over 800,000 people, and we would be approximately half of the population of that new water services entity. So Christchurch City and Banks Peninsula, approximately half of that population. With reform, the average household costs per year have been estimated at the numbers that you can see on the screen. For Entity A, so that's Auckland, Northland, which has a much greater population, something around 1,700,000, is 800 per household per year. Moving through Entity B and C, a little over 1,200 per household per year, and for Entity D, the 1,640 per household per year. And that is reflecting a smaller population for Entity D, but also a less dense urban form, by and large, across the South Island compared to the other three entities. One of the big assumptions here is that we will get significant benefits from scale, and that is no doubt true. However, there's still some work on evaluating how much those benefits of scale will accrue to each of the entities and where some of those benefits will land. But in essence, central government is emphasising that we will get strategic and more coordinated asset planning across our regions, and more consistency in things such as infrastructure design standards. We will be able to take a catchment-based approach to getting better outcomes for water quality and water resource management, because those entities will be delivering the 3 water services across the whole of those catchments. The supply chains for that big uptick in infrastructure should be able to get more certainty in terms of the forward work program and the funding of that forward work program. One of the really important aspects too that's being emphasised is that for the workforce. So there are capability and capacity issues with some of the smaller councils where they simply don't have the depth of expertise across the 3 water services that they would like, and they have insufficient staff and insufficient funding to retain that expertise. So that expertise would be available from the larger scale entities to be spread across the smaller communities. And finally, there would be better career pathways and opportunities for that workforce to both specialise and increase. So looking at the entities themselves, the model on the right is the governance model, and I apologise that it's quite a detailed and complex model, but it is indeed quite a detailed and complex governance arrangement. So the local authorities would be the owners of the entities on behalf of their communities. So that is the public ownership model. In terms of the governance, the first level of governance there is for the local authority representatives to sit alongside mana whenua representatives as part of a regional representative group. So there would be a regional representative group for each of the 4 entities. That group would appoint a selection panel, an independent selection panel, which would in turn appoint the board of the entity. And it's the board of the entity, of course, that sets the direction and has oversight of the management of that entity. And it's worth drawing attention to some of the other agencies on the side. So on the left-hand side of that water services entity, you will see Taumata Arawai. So Taumata Arawai are the regulator. So they will have oversight of the drinking water standards and oversight of water and wastewater quality. The regional councils are still sitting there with their resource management responsibilities. So the entity will still apply to the appropriate regional councils for water takes and for discharges to water, and the regional councils will still oversee consent compliance and the appropriate conditions for those. So there's a dual role there with Taumata Arawai and the regional councils for that regulatory and enforcement function. And then there's a proposal for a new economic regulator to oversee these water services entities and their charging frameworks, and no doubt also look at their investment profiles and ensure that those are appropriate. There's also a consumer body, although we have less information on what that consumer body will do, but it would be looking after the rights of the consumers and customers. So looking to economic regulation. So economic regulation is used in other industries where there's a natural monopoly. So economic regulation will be required for these big regional entities, and it is tasked with driving good long-term outcomes for consumers. So we want to see efficient pricing, we want to see efficient procurement and good asset management. There will also be incentives to invest and innovate and ensure that there are levels of service that reflect what the consumer wants. The economic regulation tools will include the usual range of tools around price, quality, disclosure and regulation, and it is anticipated that MB, the Ministry for Business, Innovation and Employment, will issue a public consultation document early next year in terms of that economic regulation regime. So moving off the proposals for reform themselves and onto the central government's funding packages. So central government has announced a number of funding packages starting last year and then moving all the way back to just July, and no doubt there will be more in the future as they're building these changes. So there was 700 million back in 2020, and that included the stimulus funding for local authorities. And you'll recall that some of that was in response to COVID-19, where a number of councils reduced their programs, reduced their investment, and this was to top that back up in many senses and add more money into investing in water and wastewater infrastructure. And there was some 40 million allocated to Christchurch as part of that. Another 296 million has been put on budget for the establishment of the new entities. So that's for this year and for next year. The more recently announced money is the 500 million, which is called the No Worse Off funding, which includes 50 million to be shared by Auckland, Wellington and Christchurch. And that is about stranded overheads and other costs that councils would face if they opted into transitioning their water services into a new entity. There will be some costs there, and the government is proposing this money to offset those costs. And then the next is the 2 billion, which they call the Better Off funding, which would be available from 2024 for central government, for local government to invest in their own districts, and that is targeted at urban development and climate change adaptation matters. And there is 120 million that has been indicated there for Christchurch. So that's financing in the future. So to the Christchurch City Council and our participation in this reform program. So we signed a memorandum of understanding with the Crown back in August 2020, and that was to say that we would work with the Crown and work with central government in their reform program and help them develop the options and provide information into that process. So as part of that, we received the 40 million in stimulus funding, which we need to spend by March next year. And in January 2021, we provided an enormous amount of data into the Crown's analysis. So that's on the financials and on the performance of our systems. So there was a lot of information that went across, and there's been a lot of toing and froing that has continued to this day, actually, on refining that information. That has resulted in some high-level financial dashboards showing average costs for services now and what they would be in the future with and without reform. All of the information that has been provided from the Crown, so what they've done with the data, how they've modelled it and then given it back, is currently being evaluated and checked by councils across the country, including this council.
Helen, sorry to interrupt, just to clarify that MOU that we signed, that left us totally free to disengage in this process at any time. There was no obligation to stay in. Just wanted to make that clear. That's
correct. So that was an engagement and a provision of information. It wasn't a decision to opt in to the reform itself. Thanks. It was to explore. So moving on to the financials and what we know. And the first thing to note about this table is that this is about what the financials would look like at the time of transfer. Okay, so if this council opted into a new water services entity and we put ourselves out in the financial year 23-24, this is what it would look like. So at present, well, we estimate that as at 23-24, the total value of the Three Waters assets would be 6.9 billion, out of just under 18 billion of council's total assets. The Three Waters debt would be sitting at around 1.1 billion out of a total debt of 2.9 billion. If you flipped the transition and we moved into a water services entity, then the council's Three Waters assets, of course, would go to zero, total assets to 11 billion, and that debt to 1.8 billion. Now, I said before that we were still testing the Department of Internal Affairs and central government numbers, and indeed they are releasing what they call the commercial dashboard to us within the next few days, where we can continue to review and possibly challenge some of these calculations to ensure that we've got the correct picture. So moving on to the impact on rates, and again we're looking forward to the time of transfer and estimating the rates prior to Three Waters shifting across. That would be some 702 million, and 294 million of that is allocated to Three Waters. Now that's a relatively simplistic assumption, so it simply takes the Three Waters out and leaves all of the overheads back with council. So we would need to refine that as we move forward. And the other thing that it does is it ignores any government money coming in. So that's just the picture as it would look from the council perspective, without any offset from central government, which may or may not be negotiated depending on what the decisions are. So the estimated rates post Three Waters moving would be that 408 million. What we don't have yet any clarity on is what the water revenue is required for that new entity, and therefore what the new overall cost to ratepayers would be in that first year of transition, and how that would work. It is worth noting that in the Department of Internal Affairs papers on water reform, when they've talked about the setup of these new entities and the charging arrangements, the new entities will be enabled to charge for water either through rates as they are now, or through volumetric charges, or through connection fees. However, they note that there may be a transition period where they would simply collect money from the councils, who would collect money from customers and consumers on the same basis they do today. So there could be some transition arrangements there. What we propose to do is to have a look at what the average cost per household would be if, in terms of the looking forward to 2023-24, in terms of our current long-term plan, where we are not in reform, we have limited costs in our long-term plan and in our infrastructure program for any updated standards and regulations, and what that would look like next year in financial year 25, and then looking out to 2031 and 2051. And then look at that again if we opt out of reform and have to step up our investment to meet those new regulations and standards. And the final one, if we opt into reform, and what the impact of that change in standards would be. So there's quite a lot of work still to be done to populate this table, but we just wanted to highlight that we will be comparing these three scenarios and showing what it would mean for households and how that would change over time. So where we are today, we are at the very beginning of an 8-week period where we're looking at the proposals from central government and their preferred model for reform of water services delivery. So no formal decisions are required over that 8-week period, but central government wants feedback on the impacts of the proposed reform and how those could be improved for particular councils and for local communities. This engagement period doesn't trigger the need for formal consultation, however, that is possible in the future. In terms of what we're looking at over the next 8 weeks, while a lot of it is about the finances and funding and populating those tables that we have there, understanding the impact on our balance sheet, what it does to debt capability, what it does to rates, we also want to look at the services that are being offered. So what is needed for complying with the new drinking water standards, what is needed to comply with increases in terms of the standards and regulations around wastewater and stormwater, particularly with the Essential Freshwater Program, and what is needed for a sustainable and robust stormwater network, particularly with climate change in the future. The other thing that we're also doing at the moment is looking at other water supplies and wastewater systems across our district, so those that are not presently looked after by council but may become the responsibility of council in the future. So we're doing a needs assessment across those. We are also contributing to the development of the workforce and the delivery of services with that workforce and the training of that workforce. So we have been facing workforce constraints over the past few years, and those constraints are getting more difficult, partly with COVID-19 and partly because we have an ageing workforce. So we're looking at what we can do to improve that workforce and its capability. And then there are the social, community and wellbeing outcomes. So talking with Ngāi Tahu and the local runanga, looking at what the local infrastructure priorities would be and where our development and growth needs are. In terms of the key focus areas for Christchurch, many of these have been talked about over the last 6 to 12 months as the water reform program has been progressing and as we've faced already some increased challenges in terms of compliance. So the top of our list is, no surprise, is safe drinking water without permanent residual disinfection. So the Water Services Bill, as it stands, would introduce mandatory residual disinfection of all community drinking water supplies, and any community drinking water supply that does not want chlorine must apply for an exemption. So that is a focus area for us, and we are working on what would be needed for that exemption and talking to some other local authorities who are interested in that. The second area, which is of great value to us and also of concern to us looking at the reform program, is in stormwater management and the multi-value approach that we take here. So here we're looking at ecology, culture, recreation, heritage, landscape and drainage, and particularly across our soft stormwater assets, which include hundreds of hectares of ponds, wetlands, basins, swales and our network of urban streams. So those soft stormwater assets are integrated into our urban form and contribute enormously to our amenity across our city. And many people don't know that the dog walking area and those recreational tracks are actually through operational stormwater management systems that collect water and treat that water before discharging it into the local rivers and streams. So that is a very important part of that for us. The third area is around charging for households for free water services and what the basis of that charge would be, and the potential for moving from rate based on property value to fixed charges or volumetric charges or some combination of that. So there may be changes in the future around that, and we would be interested in understanding what those might be for our community and what the community concerns would be. There's also the issue of the potentially uneven distribution of benefits from those economies of scale. So we talked about the economies of scale and what the average costs per household would be, and clearly the average cost per household here in Christchurch will still go up, and it will go up. It may not go up, or it may even go down for other communities. So for small councils that already pay considerably more than households in Christchurch pay, moving to a water services entity and having those costs spread across a much greater population would mean an uneven distribution of the benefits. So the small councils, or the consumers in those smaller council areas would benefit more from this reform program than people here in Christchurch. And we need to test that and understand that. And finally, there's the issue of local voice and how is the local voice heard in these new entities, particularly in the prioritisation of investment. So when they're deciding which drinking water system or which wastewater plant is to get an upgrade next, how do they hear the local voice and how do they prioritise those investments? So all of that leads to the need to engage with the community of Christchurch, and public consultation would be expected in October 2021. Central government haven't confirmed their expectations regarding community engagement and consultation at the end of this 8-week period of testing the reform and responding back to central government on those reforms. However, this council has clearly indicated that it expects to consult with the public on whether it opts in or opts out of the water reform program later this year. So there's just to touch a little bit on timelines and milestones through to July 2024. So here we're starting back in August 2021 here with Crown and Council engagement, and we have this 8-week period through to the beginning of October. In October, there would be the beginning of public consultation, and we're also expecting a cabinet paper which would address the feedback from all of the councils across New Zealand from this period of having to respond to these proposals. Cabinet decision would be expected later in the year, and then councils would need to decide whether they're opting in or opting out. Also of note in November is a cabinet paper on the economic regulator, and of course then there would be consultation on that the following year. The stimulus funds we've just noted up there in March 2022 that we need to finish delivery of that, and we've noted that that would also mark the beginning of our new 3 waters maintenance contracts. And then through July 2022 there's the potential for the No Worse Off funding to be released, so that's to assist councils who decide to go ahead with transition, and there would be a number of working groups on transition issues to ensure the best possible outcomes from that transition. You'll note that along the bottom we've also put in that health reform is continuing, that resource management reform is continuing, and of course the work program for the future of local government, and these are all linked. So there's a lot of reform underway from central government. I'm happy to leave it there and take questions.
Oh, thanks, Helen. That was an excellent presentation. We'll open up for questions. We'll start with Leanne, then Aaron.
I noticed when you mentioned it that the Water Services Bill was reported back yesterday, and when are we going to get a kind of a slide on that? Because I'm a bit worried about what I've just read, and I may have misunderstood it.
I'm sure that our 2 operational policy people will be reading that and developing that right now, and we'll get something through to you as soon as possible.
Right, because we may have to have another kind of briefing on it, because it's and also see where we sit with it, because I mean they've left the residual disinfection mandate in there.
Yes.
And I think they've made the exemption harder for us to obtain, but I could be wrong. All right. Thank you very much for the briefing as a whole. I think it's really important to take us through what's been proposed in a factual way. I'm seeing a lot of information, a lot of rhetoric, and I'm seeing some very poor quality advertising on the television, which doesn't help the quality of discussion we ought to be able to have. But I guess if you could flick back to the slide that one before, that one. What's in it for us? You know, and that is the ultimate question. What is in it for us? Because is the uneven distribution of benefits from economies of scale, I can get why the government wants to do this, but choosing to allow the urban centres to essentially pick up the backlog, as it were, or pick up the burden of the redistribution doesn't seem fair. And in the roading area, we have a sort of a cost sharing arrangement with 50-50 with the transport agency. But in the water area, I don't feel like the government's really seriously looked at that, and I know that we raised it with them originally when that original offer came out to work under a memorandum of understanding. We said to them that after the earthquakes, it was the cost-sharing arrangements on infrastructure that enabled us to make progress. And if they've got a deficit in particular areas, they now know where that deficit is. So why don't they structure their approach around the deficit areas and fund those before they would move to a model which would make the citizens of this city and Auckland and Wellington and Hamilton, probably Tauranga, pay for the underinvestment in other areas.
Yeah, so there are a couple of issues in there, and there is a lot of testing of the financial information to happen. But yes, that is a very good question, that uneven distribution of benefits, and how could central government address that in terms of other funding mechanisms, and particularly not only the uneven distribution of benefits within one of the entities, but the uneven distribution of benefits across the country, with the entity A having the average of $800 per household through to entity D, which is here in the South Island. So a north to south drift up in pricing, if you like, and whether or not there are other mechanisms for funding could certainly be part of our response to central government and making sure there is a better distribution of benefits across the country and across the communities.
And asking the question of have other options actually been explored. We seem to have been presented with just one. So I've got Aaron, then Mike, and then Tim.
Yeah, and agree with those previous points just raised. So I just got a question, because we have to, consultation aside, we have to make a decision on behalf of the people of Christchurch to opt in or opt out later on. And I look at slide number 15, which has got entity D, with the average household cost of being $1,640 per year, is on page 15. And then I just did a quick search on our rating. So if you've got an average property in Christchurch of 520 in the glorious ward of Herwood, Gardeners Road, that property would be, and their annual rates is $3,032, of which Three Waters comes to $1,028. So they would be 20% worse off than they currently are. So the question would be, could we deliver the Three Waters reforms and get it to a level that would cover what the government wants for less than a 20% rates increase?
It's a very good question, and
Yeah.
that is one of the things that we're testing.
And before we do the opt-in and opt-out, I think as a council and as a community we should know that number.
Certainly. And that is some of the work that is going on, and will populate some of those tables of what it would mean with reform, without reform, and with the uptick that we need to see in investment in infrastructure and investment in the operation of our networks to meet what we expect to see in terms of new standards and regulations. So
Right.
we can't ignore that increased requirement as well.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks for the presentation. Just a question around the assets and debt. Does that include things like the roadside gutters, the wetlands, etc.?
Oh, sorry, I missed that query.
When you look at the quantum for the assets and debt, does that also take into consideration the roadside gutters, wetlands, all the stuff that's actually going to fall into stormwater?
Yeah, I mean, it includes all our stormwater assets. I'm not across in the detail of how we apportion those. Yeah, so I'd assume it includes all the wetlands, the gutters. I'm unsure. Do you know within our activities?
Some of the roading ones are including as part of our roading assets, but it does include all of the wetland assets. So all of the large stormwater treatment systems from the stormwater network, and where we either have big filtration systems or extensive wetlands and basins, those are included.
Okay. Because I guess if they're going to start sweeping our gutters, everything should be in the right place.
The challenge is that our system, our budgeting systems, weren't set up to be able to respond to a Three Waters reform like this. So part of the work that we will need to do going forward is to try and make sure that we've got a fairly very clear indication of what the total assets associated with the wider Three Waters are, and see where the government lands as to what it sees as being in Three Waters and what it sees as being outside of Three Waters.
Yeah, well, and I guess that's the thing with stormwater. It's much more than just pipes and plants.
Yes. Yeah.
Can I just add a brief
sorry.
comment just to Councillor Keelan's query before? That 1640 figure that was displayed up there before, and as Helen mentioned, we are evaluating, checking those figures, but that figure, as proposed by the DA, was at FY51, so that's a future figure. So that comparison between what's currently being paid now and a property in Harewood and that, it's not a true comparison, and we will bring you some figures as we progress that allow you to make those comparisons. And it's a subtle thing, but just something I do want to emphasise is that there should be a slight tweak to that wording there. It says average household cost. It's the cost per average, it's the average cost per household. So that may sound like it's like tiny wording, but it's important. It's not an average household, it's the cost, average cost per household. Does that make sense? Just so there's no misunderstanding.
So those will be the increases in 2051.
Yeah, so by 2051, at the moment the DA is suggesting that, but as I said, we're reviewing those figures. So I don't want you to make decisions or start making decisions in your mind based on figures we're still evaluating. And,
Yeah,
you're coming back
there's
on.
still a lot of information that we're waiting for, both from within our organisation and from the Crown. Have you got a supplementary, Aaron, on that?
just
Sorry,
just
Tim.
to that, when you take the $180 billion worth of work that needs to be done and divide it by every rateable property in the country, the number is around $1,600 per year from now for the next 30 years. So, I mean, I don't think that is in 2051. I think that's from day one, but it'll be good to know for sure.
Yeah, look, we'll
Yeah.
come back with those figures.
Cool,
Thanks,
thank
Aaron.
you.
Tim?
Yeah, thank you. And the most worrying thing about this is actually I've done the same thing Aaron has done, so that's a concern in itself. Yeah, well, the average house price in Christchurch is $526, and following on from this slide, if you take out the Three Waters, the water, the land, drainage, and the sewer, which is around about $1,000, if you're looking at our rates breakdown, which anyone can look at. The difference is around about $600. So I think we need some real close sums, as close as we can get, because when we make this decision, as we're all fully aware, we have to vote on what is best for the ratepayers of Christchurch, because what we also will need is, if the opt-out decision is made, what that cost will be on the rates as well. And it's really hard when the information we've been given is there's a difference of $65,000 million. So that's the difference between 120 billion and 185 billion over 30 years. That's a huge amount of money. We can say just round it off at $1 billion, but $65,000 million. So we've got to make some decisions, as you're fully aware, and thank you for the information, and it's a great presentation, but the information that's coming from the entity or from the central government is still, I think, there are gaps there and a bit shady, and it's just getting... I do not envy you trying to sit there telling us information which is so vast when that's what you've been given. So, at the moment, I find I'm struggling to kind of look at how I can support it without the facts, because there's a $65,000 million gap for over 30 years, which is huge.
Right.
We'll workshop with you on slide 23,
Yep.
Which is
Yep.
that one there,
Yeah.
which will and make sure that we try and get the
Great.
very information that you're...
Thank you. There, and because the other one is, I guess, I can totally understand when say an entity, say if we go over entity D, and we just average it out, and everyone's going to be better off. But actually, many of us won't be better off, because those, and I don't want to be, I won't mention any small areas, but the requirements that are being required from the government are really unreachable for a small community if that's the requirement. You know, when you're building a house, you want to have the gold plated, but you're not going to afford it, so you want it waterproof and you want it warm. So you'd settle for that. So drinkable, and the wastewater is clean when it's getting back into the environment. That would be the ideal, but how we get there may not be the golden route.
That's right. Thanks, Tim. Sam?
Yeah, thanks, Helen, for a pretty thorough presentation. It was useful and really good. It's public facing. Just a couple from me. So the first one would be, I mean, we talked about the efficiencies by having 4 entities. Have they modelled what it would look like to have 1?
Yes, they
Probably.
have.
Yep. And what would that do in terms of the price?
I haven't got the detail
Yeah.
to hand.
Even at a future point, it would be good to just see.
Yes,
Yep.
yes, certainly they've modelled that.
Okay. The next one was around the point around privatisation. If we could go back to that, I don't know what slide it was, because it talked about them embedding in the legislation, including a majority referendum. But I mean, that wouldn't be a definite, would it? I mean, you could in theory have Leanne might know, but you could in theory have legislation that would override the provision to have a referendum, couldn't you?
To
So
privatise.
they're saying in there they'd have legislation which protects against future privatisation, which includes the provision for a 75% majority referendum. But in theory, legislation could override that, couldn't they?
Well, I'm deeply uncomfortable with this provision, as you know.
Yeah.
The 75% majority referendum refers to the local authority owners.
Yep.
So it would be a referendum of the owners,
To then,
but the 75% would be written into the legislation, which could be changed
that's what I was getting
by a
at.
simple majority.
it's not a
It's not going to be an
guarantee, is it?
entrenched provision.
No. So
Yeah.
it's-
Oh, sorry, by the decision of government
yeah.
in Parliament by a simple majority, because it's not an entrenched provision.
So it's not when
Unless
they
they
say
entrench it with 75%,
yeah.
but even then the entrenchment provision isn't entrenched, so there you go.
So I mean, because that jumped out to me as something that they say, oh no, it'd be okay, there'll be a referendum, but we just need to be really clear that in fact, like you say,
I would rather that the ownership of the
or
assets...
it can be overridden. It's not
I would
a
rather
guarantee.
that we found a way that the ownership of the assets did not leave the individual councils.
Yeah.
That would be my preference.
Well, that would be the protection against privatisation.
That
wouldn't
would be the protection.
it? Yeah. What's another layer?
And
yeah.
I think that if we got under 50% of the total value for the entity, then we could actually have a separate entity. I mean, and be under 50%.
Yeah.
And that way it wouldn't be on our balance sheet. No control. So, you know, I mean, there's water to go under the bridge yet.
Okay, so that's a useful one. And just the other thing was we talked about the costs now, and Michael, maybe one for you, and then going forward. Is there a cap annually on what that increase could be, or like Aaron says, could it be literally we started at $1,000, they ramp it up to $1,600 in year 2? Have they put any risk, or have they announced any intentions around? I'd probably use Dawn's example from the UK around the 2% increase, and if you don't, you've got to go back and get approval from central government. So have they looked at that?
I mean, I think that's where the economic regulator will come into play.
Right.
Because as Helen pointed out in the presentation, and consumer protection, yes, as Helen pointed out in the presentation, it's a monopoly area, and they do need, monopoly areas do need regulation.
But at the moment, there's no intention. I mean, they're not going to say it'll be 2% a year or 1% a year.
There's an intention to have regulation,
Yes.
but they haven't said exactly what it is.
Yeah, and what that might look like.
The third point on that slide.
Yeah, it would just be good to get some clarity for people around, or certainly what their intentions are.
Yeah, and that's the cabinet paper that we're expecting in November.
Okay, perfect. And just 2 other, Pauline, if it's okay. The other one was around the governance structure, and it talked about so I don't know, David, if we can go back to that. So it talks about the local authorities being effectively the entity owners in legislation. Then you would have the local iwi along with local authority reps who would appoint an independent selection panel. Is that independent selection panel independent as such, or is it a combination of people on that overarching regional representative group?
They're appointed.
So they're actually
whether or not it could include some of those ones on that I assume it could
So
include
it could
some of the
include-
ones on the regional representative
Well,
group,
they
but it's
appoint
not
themselves.
envisaged to be a subset of the regional group.
Yeah, so it
It
wouldn't
is
be.
envisaged to be an appointed selection panel.
So it wouldn't be like potentially iwi or elected members. It would be just
I
professionals.
think it would include some of those, yes.
Yeah. Have they signalled that yet? What that looks like? Yeah.
Not that I've seen. I would imagine with an independent selection panel, the normal rule of thumb is that they've got the expertise to do the appropriate interview. vet and make appointments. So
Yeah.
that's what I would read from that, unless it's written somewhere else that we haven't picked up on.
Right.
But the question is, can they appoint their own members onto that? So I think it's a very good question to take forward.
Yeah, okay, and just the last one, it's a wee bit cheeky, but what would happen right now if we told them to bugger off and not take our assets?
You've got this eight-week period. At the end of that, the government's going to review what the responses are from local authorities around the country, and they will make a decision as to whether, in what way they're going to move forward, whether it's a mandatory or a non-mandatory basis. I think what we've described here today is the government's position and where they've got to. I think they've illustrated clearly, well, pretty much across the country, not in individual councils. It's not a criticism of our council or any other council, but across the country, that there are some issues that need to be addressed. That's what they're calling their case for change. They seem quite motivated in actually attending to those issues. I think the question for councils going forward is, have they got the solution, the model for going forward right? And that's where your response back to the government could be most helpful.
Right, okay. And we'll talk about the heads of agreement later, I imagine.
Yes.
Yep. Okay, thanks, Pauline.
We've got Mel and then Yanni and then Jimmy.
I was going to just check about the those values, the 1640 and that actually being in 2051, that value for the cost to ratepayers. But the other question I've got is actually around the case for change that you've described for drinking water, wastewater and the stormwater. Has there been any indication of any kind of timelines of how quickly those things will be resolved, like when they expect to get all the wastewater plants operating on valid consents, that kind of thing? Are we looking at this will be fixed by 2051 or?
So the program of action is enormous in terms of addressing that infrastructure deficit, and there's no doubt that that will take decades to complete. However, central government has been quite clear in terms of its priorities being the delivery of safe drinking water, and the second priority would be to improve the collection and disposal of wastewater, and the final would be on the stormwater management.
Right.
So they have clearly signalled that is the order of priorities.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Thanks. So Yanni?
So has there been any recognition from government around the extraordinary expensive costs of the forced chlorination that we've had to go through?
As part of the water reform program, I would say no. The water reform program is around essentially the institutional arrangements and the regulatory arrangements, rather than individual responses from individual community water suppliers. So the program of action is, as Miles said, it's at a national level. Right. And rather than picking on individual issues, except by way of example, so Havelock North and the incident there.
That's what kind of strikes me as kind of weird. They've used Havelock North as the example, yet where they've got other examples like what we've had to do in Christchurch after the earthquake, and then with the chlorination. And do you know if they've, like, is there any, in all the paperwork and all the, I mean, there's been so much information, but have they ever considered the social impact of what they're proposing on people? I mean, the hot water cylinders is the classic example in Christchurch, but for people's ability to actually be able to be involved in decision making or feel some sense of social cohesion around the services that are delivered, or the impact of the charges, is there any reference to any of that?
So one of the big drivers has been equitable access to services. So there are communities at the moment that do not have adequate drinking water and do not have adequate wastewater services. So that has been one of the big drivers for change. So yes, that those social outcomes and those public health outcomes are driving the reform program.
But just, I
at
mean,
its
just in-
heart.
in
And
simple-
then the environmental outcomes in terms of wastewater and stormwater.
Yeah.
But
So
in
those outcomes are there.
In simple terms, like the idea, you know, of people being able to afford water as a luxury or as a, you know, not being delivered as a basic right into the things like volumetric charging and all the sort of issues that we've heard through as we've gone through that process. Is there any reflection around, you know, the way in which people get disconnected if they can't pay with some of these models, or
Yes.
and what does that highlight?
Well, some of that is covered under the Health Act already, in that we must provide basic services for sanitation, whether someone pays their bill or not. So in terms of volumetric charging, and where volumetric charging is already rolled out in this country, if someone doesn't pay their bill, you cannot cut off their water, just the same as if you have health needs, you can't cut off the electricity.
Right.
So a basic service must be maintained,
people do
but it
get-
can be a restricted service that is just what is required for public health.
I mean, we just, you know, 2 days ago had people losing power, one of the coldest nights of the year. So, you know, and again, this has been fed back through looking at the telecommunications sector and the electricity sector. So I guess, I'm concerned from that social impact that there's not enough focus on, you know, the risk around people's ability to access water, given what we've seen with these other corporatisations.
We can provide you with some additional information on exactly that point if you
Yeah,
would like.
and would we be in a position to consider the feedback around learning the lessons from the electricity sector or the telecommunications and putting forward some really clear principles about people's access to water as a basic right rather than a service?
I think that's part of what is around the economic regulator and the consumer protection provisions. So yes, we can
Yeah.
make suggestions for what we
Okay.
would see as appropriate in there.
Yeah, and just, the Mayor's just alluded to the exemption, so given that this is, we're probably the biggest city that has the issue with the exemption, have they had any discussions about what's been going through the House with us, around what they've proposed and how realistic it is that we could access it, or?
Yes, and this council made submissions on the bill. So Leanne went up to Wellington and made a strong submission on the bill.
But the bill's been passed now. Was it passed yesterday, did you say?
It's come back.
It's come back, reported back from the Select Committee.
Has come from the Select Committee.
Yeah.
Reports come from the Select Committee back into the House, so I haven't looked at where it's on the agenda, but it's quite a detailed set of changes to the legislation, so I want advice from staff before
Get the advice.
we would
Yeah.
consider
I
it.
just wondered, what I was trying to understand was based on our submission and based on the sort of Select Committee process.
You're just trying to say that I'm an ineffective submitter.
No, not at all. No, quite the contrary. I was just, like, our council, when we first met with Alan Pragnell upstairs about, 2-3 years ago, one of the things that we made very clear is a very explicit exemption process. That was really important to us. So I'm just trying to understand within all the stuff that's been proposed, whether, we've made the submission, there's a bill, whether DIA have shown any comprehension of the significance of the exemption to us as a city.
Can you refer, because I think Yanni's mixing up two processes, because the lead on this one is the Ministry of Health, isn't it, for the
Water Services Bill?
The Water Services Bill.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. However, so there have been strong submissions and a lot of participation between this council and central government at a political level and at a staff level on the issues around drinking water safety and permanent residual disinfection and the exemption regimes. I can't answer the question about are they listening, but I can say that we have been talking and discussing and participating wherever we can.
Thanks, Helen. Okay, Jimmy. Thanks, Yanni.
One question is in relation to the engagement and public consultation, because based on this time schedule, formal public consultation will be commence at October beginning. But this 8 weeks is focused on the engagement. But based on your slides, particularly emphasize, this the new water reform is focused on engage with local council, EV, and also the local community. I'm not sure who are those community, who they are, And also regarding to our council, at the end of September, if we feedback to the central government, either we agree to the new entity or not agree, how do we know, have any formal channel? We know the majority of the people in Christchurch, they agree or not. How do we get this information?
So this 8-week period is to consider the information, evaluate the information, test the assumptions, challenge them, and then for council to respond back to central government about where it thinks the information is good or not good, where it thinks it needs more work, and what changes this council could see to improve the system. So this is not an opt-in or not opt-out. This is responding to what this council may or may not like about the proposals and what this council suggests could improve what central government has proposed or amend or add to. So that's what this period is for. This isn't about whether you decide to opt in or opt out. That comes next.
This is an elected member's response opportunity, and then the wider community engagement will follow that.
Okay, but here your slides mentioned they engage with the local community, who they are, local community, your slides. The 4 pillars of water reform, last sentence, who they are.
Sorry, I'm not sure which slide. Sorry, which slide are you talking about?
The 4 pillars of water reform.
The 4 pillars. Yes, so that's central government's case for change, and central government have said that they are engaging across local government, iwi, Māori and local communities. And part of their engagement has been that the information is available on public websites, and part of it has been perhaps that advertising campaign that was mentioned earlier.
But it's not seeking the feedback from the community.
Not at this. At this stage, most of the feedback is from, for this part of it, is from councils, from elected representatives. That's who they are seeking feedback from.
Thanks. Okay, Phil. And then Sarah.
Thanks, chaps. I actually feel sorry for you guys that you're trying to sell us a car and the government are only giving you the bits as they see fit. At the moment, you've got a couple of wheels and a steering wheel, maybe. But come December, should this, where it says opt-in and opt-out, I don't think it should just have mandate. It shouldn't have opt-out at all. You're either in or they're going to tell us we're in. What is that? Am I putting words in your mouth, maybe?
Well, first of all, we're not here to sell you anything. The point what we're trying to illustrate is there's quite a bit of information.
You're just putting forward what you've been asked to put forward.
That is yet to come.
I feel sorry for you having to do that. Because when I went to the local government conference, and I was quite excited to see that they were going to talk about 3 waters on the agenda. But then I find out the only reason it was on the agenda is because our CE asked them to get it on there. It was the most important thing of the whole weekend, and they talked for an hour. It was on for an hour. They talked for 50 minutes and 10 minutes of questions. We could have had a whole half day on that. So it was very disappointing, and so I just
Thanks, Phil. And Sarah.
Thanks. I realise that this is in 8 weeks where we're giving organisational and elected member feedback, and that it's not yet time for a formal opt-in, opt-out type conversation with our community. But we're hearing a lot from our community that they also have specific concerns around bits and pieces. So is there a reason why we can't, for example, ask for specific community feedback on the information that the government's given us and attach that to our feedback to the government? Just as feedback, not a consultation. Do we do it, do we not? But you say these are the things that the government's proposing. What are the specific concerns that you have, or are there things that you think could be done better? And we could synthesise that in some way, or we could just straight attach it to go through. And that way we're allowing that community feedback to probably back up the stuff that we're already saying and give community a voice in this process.
I don't think there's any reason why we can't do that. I think one of the issues to address there, though, is going out without the right amount of information.
Well, I mean, at this stage, it'll be the same information that we've got. And we've got presentations that have been given that are up online. We've got lots of information. All of the stuff is public. Yes, some of the feedback may be not particularly well informed, but that doesn't make it any less valid. And I think that if we have a portal to just gather that community feedback where we can collate it and also feed that through to the government, I think that would allow the community to have a voice at least when it may be that at the end of the 8 weeks there isn't a consultation, if you like, if it's mandated.
Yeah, I think and I agree, Sarah, that we've been actually wanting to consult with people.
This wouldn't be a consultation,
I know,
yeah.
But we always come back to the fact that we don't have all of the information to offer them. But I agree with Sarah that I think we've got enough to actually gauge a feeling about this from people, and people are going to be wanting to know. So let's see what we can do. Leanne, have you got something to add?
Yeah, could we go back to my favourite slide? Yeah, that one. I wondered whether it would be useful for us to test these with our community, because these are issues that we've discussed around the table that we're concerned about in terms of the model. There may be others that people want to add to that list of concerns, and it may be even around the ownership, the potential for privatisation. You know, all of those issues. If we did that and got feedback from the community on the concerns rather than on the specifics of the proposal, because we haven't actually got the specifics of the proposal. Tim asked a very good question. What does this cost our residents if we don't do it? If we opt out, what is the impact on our residents? We don't actually know the answer to that question. And so that's an idea for how we engage with our communities. But I did have a supplementary question as well. So I don't know whether... have you finished, Sarah?
Could we have some time to then come back? I know time is short, but could we come back with a consultation proposition for you?
Or engagement.
An engagement proposition for you.
Yeah, that would be good. And the second thing was, and because we don't, I mean, perhaps go to the, no, and I don't even know which slide to go to. It's the one that kind of says, it really emphasises the level of deficit around the country. Where do we actually sit in that ourselves? I mean, it's you know, I mean, we've done a lot of work on our drinking water infrastructure. We've made big investments in our stormwater infrastructure. We've made significant investments and will be making incredibly significant investments in wastewater. And I don't think we're in the you know, breaching all over the place category as far as global consents and various other bits and pieces. We're working towards achieving things. So it just, you know, if we're on a scale, we're not down the bottom end.
They say
that just needs to be lifted.
Where are we on that kind of thing?
Yeah.
Yeah. That would be a good thing to put out as well.
Yeah, so in Christchurch, you know, as a couple of people have alluded to, it is a bit of a mixed picture in terms of performance. We're not the best in the country, and there are some good reasons for that. Not the least being the response to the Canterbury earthquake sequence. So that was devastating for the city, not just for Three Waters infrastructure.
Yeah.
So there've been some issues from that we continue to grapple with today.
And we will feed that back to central government as part of this process, won't we?
But you're absolutely right, nor are we in the bottom end amongst the worst performers. So our infrastructure systems are certainly adequate. Are they the best possible? Probably not. Yeah. So that's, I mean, it's a very short answer to a very
part of that is
complicated
because of the increased standards that we will have to meet in the future, puts us in the possibly not the best, but we're actually possibly not too far away from that really in, I think, general terms.
But what I worry about is that we're going to end up not being a priority for the new entity. And that's why I put that question about priority on that list. Because there will be others that are so much more alarming in terms of central government requirements for investment in infrastructure than we are.
So priority for investment is not an easy question either. So I mean the simple answer is where people have no adequate services, you'd want to address that. But also, size does matter when it comes to water and wastewater. And if you have very large communities, then you want very good services because you need to manage the risk to those very large communities. And that is partly why we have faced such a high hurdle in terms of getting our water safety plan for Christchurch across the line. This is a very big city. We need to have extraordinarily good systems and absolute minimal risk to public safety. Yeah. Because any contamination event would be catastrophic.
Yeah.
So that investment driver, there is still a strong driver for investing in the big urban centres. There's no doubt about it. And so that I don't think you can think that the metropolitans would suddenly become the lowest priority and all the money would go out to the small centres. No. There will be some of that, but the prioritisation is more nuanced than that.
And I think over the next 8 weeks or 7.5 weeks, that's why it's important to put our thoughts into what our feedback to the government is, particularly from a city council point of view.
Yeah. Exactly. And
do we have to wait that long though? Well, I mean,
if we haven't got the information.
No, but I mean, as soon as we get the information, how much sooner could we analyse it? I mean, why are we waiting for more information?
So we do need more information. So somebody said what we're presenting here today is largely the government's case for change and largely the government's preferred model with a little bit of what it means for Christchurch. We need to do a lot more work to define more clearly what does it mean for Christchurch, and often the devil is in that detail. We want to know what it means for those household costs. We want to know what that means over time. And that issue of prioritisation across communities is an important one for us.
We haven't seen the financial model or commercial model as they're calling it, and this will be an opportunity for us to put our, I've been informed, to put our LTP numbers into that rather than the WICS numbers or the numbers that we provided for WICS. So it'll be an opportunity to provide more up-to-date set of numbers.
But we're in week 2, and we haven't got all of that information. The information should be available before the clock starts ticking, I would have thought.
And do we know when we're getting that information?
We were told last week.
Okay. Because the other thing is, and I know you've got a question, Anne, but just on Leanne's issue, whether we could be disadvantaged in this, but it might not be that we go backwards, but our drinking water improvement program, for example, and our stormwater amenity stuff might get slowed down because it's not a priority. So not necessarily go backwards, but just it might be slowed down because that investment would go into the provincial and smaller councils. And some of those are in desperate need, so they don't have the money, so it's got to come from somewhere. Anne?
I'm just wondering about whether there's any analysis done of the economic, the sums around not investing in terms of the environmental impacts going down the line and what that will end up costing us if we don't buy into this. So maybe locally it would be quite good to know what we could end up paying to fix up the damage in the future if we don't put investment in now, because we don't actually talk. I don't know if the environment has got enough of a focus here in terms of caring for it and all those sort of impacts. So I'm wondering, is that something to be considered?
Well, certainly, and I think there has been, I'm not an expert in this field, but I think there has been some economic analysis done on the desired impacts of the essential fresh water work that is going on in terms of the wider natural environment. And that would have taken into account the investment that's required in stormwater and wastewater to improve receiving water performance, as well as on-farm and on-land investments that are required to reduce nitrates and the like. But we can follow that up and see what's available. It would be if it hasn't been done, it would be a large exercise.
I think it is something that people would write. You know, a lot of people who are obviously very concerned about the environment would like to perhaps be able to see those sorts of things.
So, with our Three Waters maintenance contracts coming up in March, what does this all mean for that?
So council's already made a decision on the Three Waters maintenance contracts.
To go for 1 year?
And yes, so we're, that decision is that we are directly negotiating with our present contractor for a 3+1+1 contract for the two waters and for the stormwater and land drainage.
So that will time out with the 2024 if that should come.
So that takes us, takes us beyond any transition, which makes it much easier, of course, for that transition to take place.
And with the water safety plans, should an entity option be adopted, would they then develop those plans in the future? That wouldn't be our role.
That's
anymore.
correct. So the new entity would take on those regulatory requirements, such as the water safety plans and the consenting.
In
So
the
they would take on
bylaws?
consent compliance. Sorry.
In the bylaws?
No, I don't. Well, I don't know. I don't know how they would do that. Whether the councils would consider to have would continue to have their bylaw making powers, or whether there would be some bespoke local regulatory power for the new entities. That's not clear to me.
Right, and then the regional councils would still be the regulator around the...
Regional councils are still responsible for water as a resource, so yes, they'd still be responsible for takes and discharges, consenting takes and discharges, and the conditions on those consents.
And would the fact that the boundaries don't align with the entity boundaries have any detrimental effect on that?
No, and that's the same as it is today.
Just
So the local authority boundaries and the regional council boundaries, there's overlaps already.
Right. So, Tim, you got another question?
Just one more. I guess the confusing thing for me, and there's quite a few things in my life, but no, the stadium's very clear now, thanks. With regards to work for tomorrow, the whole thing about drinking water, the purity and having it safe to drink, etc., and yet nowhere in this information is nitrates management. I know that is, that's going to be a different, we're looking at that differently, but how can that be separated when the whole thing is based on clean drinking water?
So there is under the Essential Freshwater Program and under the Ministry for the Environment Work Program, there is some work underway on protecting sources of drinking water. So there is work underway in there, but that's on the resource management side, but recognising the importance of water as a source of drinking water, human drinking water. It's not part of this, but it's associated, yes.
The Water Services Bill does reference this,
but,
about having a source water management plan.
That's correct. So as well as the regional council's responsibilities in protecting source water, as part of your water safety plan, you have to have a source water protection plan.
I'm doing a great job.
Yes, I'm just confused. It should actually be part of the one whole thing rather than segmenting it off. And is that, I think it's confusing. It's the base to everything. You can't, if you don't have clean water, you're going to have dirty runoff anyway. So
well, you still have these two regulatory roles. So you still have the regulatory role of the regional council sitting alongside the regulatory role of Taumata Arawa.
Yeah. I mean, it's just another layer of cake of bureaucracy for the public to look at, and I just think it should be simplified. But obviously, you can't have bureaucracy.
We do have reform for local government as one of the other strands of work going on.
Yeah, nothing like a layer cake.
Leanne, did you have something to add?
No, I've given up.
Will to live.
Yanni?
Lost the will to live.
Yeah, I mean, I think Tim's point's actually quite pertinent to Christchurch and Canterbury. I mean, the fact that they're going to have the regional council having greater, as I understand it, responsibility around water regulation, and look at the example of what's happened in Canterbury, where we've got nitrates. So I think it's a huge concern, and we should raise it. But I mean, I just wanted to concur with the comments I think Sarah was making. I'm just concerned that we don't get a chance for our community to express a view before we give feedback, and then once we've given feedback, government says, right, that's your feedback, this is what's happening, and the community are just completely shut out. I think that's kind of what you were saying. So, I mean, I just think if there's something we can do with the benefit of a little bit.
Coming back to us with the proposal.
So how long will you need to bring something back?
Well, we've got another briefing penciled in next week, next Tuesday, so we'll see what we can.
Thank you.
We're already starting to get a lot of emails from, I guess,
Yes.
Bruce Smith from the West Coast, or you know, like there's already kind of people.
I'm not doing a video like that.
Putting.
No, we have to be quite. We have to
You
word
can do it
it
on the
carefully,
same.
so it's quite specific about different things about, you know,
We
the
just need
amenity
to, we
park
need
stuff.
to, we
or-
need to
But it's
understand
just-
whether they've got other concerns or whether they share our concerns.
Yeah.
And what we
It may just be quite simple. I mean, I'd rather, just all I was going to say is, given that the time is going really quickly and we'll just get
Yeah, I
quicker,
know, yeah.
I'd rather give a direction today for staff just to go and design something and do it than wait for another briefing. Oh.
Yeah. Yeah. So basically that'll be what you've asked for. They'll come back on Tuesday with a bit of an outline of what we can put out. And, yeah. Okay, so that's all the questions on that one. Thank you very much for a really, really good presentation, Helen. Really, really good. And Helen's going to stay there for the Three Waters bi-monthly report. But of course the other thing, and you just touched on it then, Miles, was the future for local government, and the big question on everyone's lips will be what then do we do when we take away about 40% of what we do? And to me that work stream should have been done before this reform anyway. So that will be an interesting progress to follow as well. Okay, so do you want to give us just some highlights of your report, Helen?
So before we move on to the report, the other aspect of the update on water reform, and it was touched on before, was the heads of agreement with Local
Yes.
Government New Zealand. And so I'll invite Ian up if he wants, if there were some questions on that, because someone indicated a question.
Does anyone have any questions on the heads of agreement? Or comment, Sam?
Yeah, it's probably more, it was more just to get a really high level, because it's such a public facing thing at the moment, just a high level understanding of what LGNZ have signed up to. Because we're obviously a member of LGNZ, and so it would be useful to understand. Yeah, I guess the concern I had when I read it was around the challenges about, you know, potentially if the government were to mandate this, them effectively agreeing that they wouldn't criticise that approach. And I was just trying to understand why we're paying for it. You know, we're paying them to effectively act on our behalf. You know, potentially why they would take an approach like that. Appreciate it may not be a legal question though, Ian, but
just give me a second. The heads of agreement says that if after the end of the period, the 8-week period, the government decides to accept an all-in legislated approach to the reforms, then LGNZ agrees it will accept such decision. That all-in participation of local authorities is needed to realise the national interest benefits. Such acceptance does not imply that LGNZ supports that approach. LGNZ will not actively oppose the approach, and it may publicly express its disappointment that the government has considered it necessary to adopt that approach. Does that answer the question?
yeah, I mean, it might be, in a sense, it may be for when we get the LGNZ president down or the chief executive to explain it, but it was more just, yeah, I guess we do need to highlight with LGNZ there are some issues with what they've done on our behalf, I think.
Yeah, but don't forget that LGNZ are also receiving various responses from different councils around New Zealand, some of which are going to benefit greatly from this, so who support it.
Yeah.
So they're pretty much on the fence. And there was a resolution brought to the AGM, the wording of which was something like LGNZ supports that individual councils should be able to make their own decisions about this and opt out if they want to, which actually goes totally contrary to 2.7b that says require all-in participation of local authorities to do so. So they've got some contradictory things going on there, but
Yeah.
they
I mean, I
are in a
guess,
difficult
yeah.
situation.
And it's probably something we can take offline, but it's around that, you know, value for what we get out of LGNZ if they're not acting on our behalf. So, yeah.
Yeah.
Cool.
Okay.
Thanks.
Are there any
Thanks,
other
Ian.
questions of Yanni?
Like, I still am struggling to understand how LGNZ can agree that it will accept a position that all in participation of local authorities is needed to realise the national interest. And basically, it just seems really strange that, like, basically the whole issue of local democracy is that we should be able to decide, and yet they've kind of agreed to this, supporting the case for change by supporting the position that there's sufficient evidence-based national case for change, and that the preferred approach to reform has been tested through design process, and that it's sound, appropriate, and beneficial. But, like, we can't even get basic information. I mean, how could anyone agree to that with all the questions that we've just had raised that we still don't have, that we were supposed to get last week?
So how could they make that statement
can
in
they-
the light of the lack
I
of
just don't-
information?
Yeah, I mean, I'm just struggling to understand, like, what position we have around LGNZ. I think did someone give us advice that we've looked at their delegations to the National Council. It's completely within their remit as an organisation to take this view.
I think Jane's got a comment here too.
So, councillors, I don't think staff can to answer those questions. That's a question to put to LGNZ, and the Mayor has
Right.
invited LGNZ President to come and talk to you.
But
so,
I think
save
the
question
key
for them.
point was we pay a subscription. There's certain obligations that would come with that subscription. There must be a standard way in which things get done. I mean, I wasn't at the AGM, but I would have thought something like this should have been a resolution through the shareholder. I think the staff or the membership, but I think staff have said that they've looked at the legality of what's been agreed in the heads of agreement in terms of LGNZ processes, and they're within their right to be able to do this. Is that correct?
Councillors, if you've got specific questions for LGNZ, if you want to send those through in advance, we can collate all those so we can have them ready for the session with the LGNZ reps.
Yeah, I thought we'd had that advice at the briefing.
You did yesterday
Yeah.
have advice on my analysis of the rules of the organisation and how that related to LGNZ's decision to enter into the heads of agreement. The other sort of questions you're asking, Jane's quite right. You should be asking them of LGNZ.
I mean, the main message that LGNZ was giving us at the conference was the fact that it's important to be working together with the Crown on this, to even if the outcome is that it doesn't proceed. LGNZ are claiming benefit for having received a lot of this money through negotiation. That's just what they're saying.
You know, shared intention, mutual
Yeah,
trust
I
and
know, Yanni,
respect,
but those are things you
constructive,
can
open
do.
and fair, no surprises. That's about contrary to every part of this process.
Yeah.
So
No, we're not.
I just wonder whether we should send a letter to LGNZ expressing concern at this. So that was going to be the final question from me.
I don't think that's in the capacity of this committee. I mean, they're going to come and talk to us anyway, so we'll sort that out. Okay, no more questions on the heads of agreement. We'll move on to Helen's report. Thank you very much, Miles. Thanks, Ian.
So just the biggest part of this report was, of course, the update on water reform, but it's also worth noting that we are out for consultation at the moment on the stormwater management plans for the Huratini Horsewell and the Opawaho Heathcote. So that is active consultation with the community in those two catchments. And
That's open till the 30th of August, I believe. Has there been very much interest?
There hasn't been a lot of interest. That's not unusual with this because they are quite focused and technical plans. However, the community groups that are active in those catchments are interested in engaging.
That's
so
good.
That is very
Are
helpful.
these zone committees able to submit on those?
We work closely with the zone committees.
Yeah, they can't submit officially, but they can.
That's correct.
Feedback. Okay. Thanks. Sorry to interrupt, Helen.
No, that's okay. And the coastal one, of course, will be next. So we'll go out with the coastal one next year. We've got an update on drinking water compliance and the ongoing revision of our water safety plans, and of course the usual update on the capital program and capital delivery. So I'm happy to take questions.
It's a very clear report. Jimmy, do you have a question?
Two questions on page 25. The table 3, maybe a minor mistake. You resubmit regarding Christchurch Littleton will be in September this year rather than last year. Am I right?
Is this the water safety plans?
Yeah. 25 on page 25. 5 non-compliance, Warren A.
Oh, we did resubmit it last year, and now we
But
will.
September, you prepare plan date for resubmission. Last column.
Oh, I see what you mean. Yeah. So we'll have to have a new date. And update that one again.
Okay.
So we will be submitting.
Second is on page 39.
You want 2 chocolate fish, Jimmy?
I read. That's why I know. Yes. Okay. Regarding to the Dunton, all those kind of a tank. This well, I just want to know what is the time frame, because this one, are you aware, in December of 2019 happened until almost 1 year and 8 months. So I'm not sure why it takes so long, because the community particularly concerned this one.
So most of the work is done on Denton. There is some work to be done with a seal across the roof that we can't do until the weather warms up. So it's just too cold to use the sealant and the proprietary material that seals the top of that tank.
But
so
when will be restart? Next month or September or?
We'll wait till the weather warms up.
Warm is December.
No, I don't think it'll be quite
Show
that
weekend,
long.
maybe? Cup week's usually
So I
quite
just
good.
don't know. Yes, but when will it be completed? If we restart, how long will be the completion?
So
Yeah.
that's not an
Will be
easy question
finished.
to ask, because we need to do the work when the weather is warm. We also have to work with our operations team to make sure we've got enough capacity in that water supply zone. So what we're doing is we're putting Denton back into service, and we're doing the works on Sockburn that we
Yes.
can do, and then when the weather is warm enough, we'll put Sockburn back in service, take Denton out, and do the membrane repairs. So it's about programming those works.
Yeah, I know that because community
They'll
that's
certainly be
concerned
done
the time frame.
I know, yeah. They'll certainly be done by the end of the summer.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to get this answer.
Yeah, thanks, Jimmy. That's a good question.
Yeah, and apologies, it has taken much longer than it should have.
So end of the summer.
Okay.
And we know that summer isn't very long here anyway. Any other questions? Well, Aaron's already moved it, I think, but you can second it, Sam. Yeah. Yanni?
Just wanted to check, there was going to be some discussions around the non-compliances. Has any of those resolved since our last briefing?
In terms of the Christchurch water safety plan?
Yeah.
No.
So
we're still working with the drinking water assessors on those.
right. And in terms of backflow prevention, how are we tracking in that regard?
So the backflow prevention, we've completed the high hazard installations, so those are completed across the city, and we're now working through the medium hazard, and then we'll work through the low hazard backflow prevention.
And
So
are we
that's tracking really well and tracking on the timetable for the improvement actions in the water safety plan.
Right, and the residential properties with medium risk, how big a work program is that?
That's a relatively small work program. Okay. However, it's a little more difficult working with individual residences than it is working with a whole lot of industry groups. So it takes a little bit longer just to negotiate it through and for people to understand that need for backflow prevention and why we need it today and we didn't need it last year, for example.
Yeah.
So we are taking time to explain that and make sure people understand.
Okay. And just the only other thing I wanted to check was in the report, there's discussion about ECAN's under page 21, a signalled strong intent to strictly monitor all resource consents associated with ground source heat pumps. So advice notes have gone out within council to be diligent with compliance. What's our responsibility in regards to building consenting for those things, and what impact does that have on us? I mean, I'm just quite concerned that I would have thought they would have been strictly monitored to start with, given the risk, but are you able just to shed any sort of update on what the impact is on us as an organisation and what we might need to think about doing?
So that so there are a number of ground source heat pumps that council itself uses. So the impact is really on our facilities management people to make sure that we are carefully monitoring in terms of the conditions of those consents. So the ground source heat pump, it's evolved from, oh, this is new, this is difficult, to, no, we think it's relatively low risk, and so we'll make it a permitted activity essentially as long as you comply with these standards, to now moving back to, oh, maybe we do need to be more concerned about this, and that's why Environment Canterbury are taking a much closer look at them and ensuring compliance with those standards.
Well, that's a good thing.
There's a risk that some will have to be decommissioned or have to be stopped?
That's a question for Environment Canterbury. I can't answer that.
Right. And do we as an organisation give any advice into funding applications for these to be put in?
Yes, we do, because we fund them through Kevin Crutchley's
Yeah.
energy management program. So yes, I presume they do give some advice.
Right.
Although they would, in terms of seeking consent or permission from Environment Canterbury, that would be up to the people who are putting them in.
So Helen, perhaps you could organise
I just
Kevin to
wonder
send
if
a memo around the committee.
Yeah, and I just wonder
on that, how they went in, and
I'd have to ask our facilities people.
if you could, and just, I mean, I think
I just wonder if we've got any liability around the funding and also around building consenting.
and the condition of them
Yeah.
and the compliance nature. Thanks, Yanni, that's a good question. Is there any other questions? No? But thank you, Helen, a really, really good reporting. And, oh yes, I had one. The ageing of the bore water for the, how's that tracking? Because that was going to be done by end of this year.
Yes, that's still tracking to be done by the end of this year. So we've had, I think there are 5 different lots of samples go through, and we've got results on, I think, the first lot, 3 lots of samples.
Yeah.
So we're waiting for the next sets to
Excellent.
work their way through.
Because it's been a 2-year
GNS.
program, hasn't it?
It's a very long program,
Yeah.
yes.
Thank you. Good work. Amazing. Okay, it's been moved and seconded. Is there any debate? I'll put the motion. All those in favour say aye. Aye. Opposed, that's carried, and I'll close the meeting with a karakia. Tukuna ti wairua ki rere ki te taumata, ko te matatika matapono hi arahi. Ina mahi, ka arotahi te tira kia eki punuku, kia eki tangaroa. Home e hui e tae ki. Thanks everybody. It's great. And thanks Helen.